All right, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone had a nice lunch. I'm pleased to now welcome you to our penultimate session on China's conclusions. So, of course, while the thrust of our conference has been the economic war between Russia and the West, we'd of course be remiss if we didn't bring in the role of the People's Republic of China. While the West has worked to economically isolate Russia, Beijing has meanwhile stepped up its trade with Moscow in a number of sectors and has helped support its wartime economy. Scholars of international politics will note with concern the growing alignment between Russia and China. And in a game of anarchical geopolitics, it may certainly make sense to group these actors together as the West's adversaries. But if our sessions over this conference have revealed anything, it's that great complexity lies below this surface. So to unpack these layers, I'm pleased to welcome you to the session, which is made possible with the support of the Fletcher Center for Strategic Studies. I'll now hand the floor over to Eyck, who needs no introduction to moderate the session. Eyck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Akshat. And before I start the session, can we please have a round of applause for Akshat and the entire team of student staff and volunteers who helped make this conference possible. Please join them. Thank you so much. This next session is on China's conclusions, and we will look at the lessons that China has drawn from economic warfare between Russia and the West over the last 2.5 years and even longer. China has, in some sense, emerged as a black knight for Russia, and so we will look at the role that China has played in supporting, mitigating, and circumventing Western sanctions. But also, China has its own economic warfare with the United States. And so we will look at how China is waging this economic conflict. How is China preparing for more sanctions? What vulnerabilities does the West have? And so on and so forth. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Eyck Freymann is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a non-resident research fellow at the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. Zoe Liu is the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and her work focuses on international finance, sovereign wealth funds, industrial policies, and the geoeconomics of energy transition. She has also written some fascinating papers on BRICS de-dollarization, and she'll be joining us virtually. And finally, we have Mihaela Papa, the Director of Research and a Principal Research Scientist at the MIT Center for International Studies, focusing on BRICS, climate change, and global governance. She's also a Senior Fellow at the Fletcher School, where she previously led the Rising Power Alliances project and taught sustainable development diplomacy, and she happens to be an alumna of the Fletcher School. So welcome to the three of you. I'll pass it to you for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you to Eyck and the organizers for the honor of the invitation. I'm looking forward to being overshadowed in this panel by Zoe and Mihaela, who have written, I think, the best book about BRICS and de-dollarization. So anticipating that they will speak a bit about that research, I want to share some of my own thoughts looking at Chinese language open source materials about how Beijing may be perceiving the conflict. There's been a lot of debate in the pages of Foreign Affairs and other reputable magazines about what lessons Beijing might be learning. And my view is that we just don't know. One of the reasons we don't know is that while there was a lively debate in the PRC about the character of financial warfare with the West up through around 2022, about 2 years ago, that debate went dark in the sense that the materials in which members of this elite policy community were speaking to each other stopped being posted online and started, in fact, to be scrubbed from databases. So I have some forthcoming work that I can talk about today. While I can't tell you how China has perceived the evolution of this story since 2022, what I can offer, I think, is a bit of historical context on how Beijing saw the emergence of a financial trade conflict with the United States starting in the mid-2010s. And then I think from that, we can make some educated guesses about what they might be thinking in line with all of the themes that have been the subjects of this conference. Beijing has always looked warily at Western sanctions. The PRC was under a US trade and financial embargo from October 1949 to 1972. During this time, they struggled to access the international financial system. They conducted a lot of essential trade through barter. And in recent years, as the PRC's economy has financialized and become more interconnected with our own, there have always been those within the national security establishment that have viewed this financial relationship with suspicion. Crudely, there's two camps. There's a national security camp that sees things through a pretty ideological Marxist lens, seeing finance as a tool of imperialist hegemony, assuming that it's dangerous to expose China's capital markets to the risk of contagion or other sorts of interference from the West, and then a by and large Western educated, highly sophisticated, financially literate community, which understands that China cannot continue its development without access and interrelationships with global capital markets. What's interesting, though, is that when they talk to each other internally, they use the ideological framing. And we know this because we have transcripts of conversations that members of these communities have had with one another. And we know that the people who know better are using the slogans and the Marxist historiographical references and so on. So while this doesn't tell us how Xi Jinping thinks about it, it, I think, emphasizes this is still a system that sees the idea of financial war in ideological terms. So in that context, when the United States began to ramp up its use of sanctions against Iran in the mid-2010s, China was very cautious. And the conclusion was essentially, we have to comply with US sanctions because we are afraid of being caught up. And the United States made an example of a couple of Chinese institutions, and the message was received. Around 2018, when the trade war began, there was right away a discussion at the highest levels of the party state about the risks that trade war could spill into financial war. The conclusion basically was, this would be a catastrophe for China. We are not ready for this, despite having a partially closed capital account. We need to prevent the escalation of this trade conflict into the financial domain for as long as possible while we build resilience. And that informed decisions to keep complying with US secondary sanctions on North Korea, for example, largely to comply with sanctions on Iran. It informed a number of other decisions too about how China approached the management of its domestic capital markets. Since the late Trump administration, Xi Jinping has been on a mission to securitize basically everything, and the financial markets and the currency are no exception. This, if we relate it to the evolution of the debate, reflects a growing perception that the United States might provoke a conflict. Remember, China is always presenting itself in defensive terms. Provoke a conflict that would provide an excuse to use some sort of financial weapon in the attempt to topple China. The fear, in at least from what we can see of the public discussion, is not so much that that sanctions would have a long-term drag on China's growth in terms of what we have seen in the Russia case. The fear, more specifically, is that China is a highly financialized economy that has a lot of restive capital bottled up by capital controls. And if financial war escalates, you have the possibility of mass outflows toppling the financial system, and in one boom, the whole system crumbles. So the fear, and I think this is pretty clearly Xi Jinping's fear, is how they bolster the resilience of the system so that the initial shock of the imposition of sanctions, across the board dollar sanctions, as unlikely as that might be, would be something that China could survive. And when I think we're thinking about how the leadership might be imagining financial contingency planning for a Taiwan crisis, for example, we need to remember Xi Jinping is generally willing to pay a price for the stuff that he wants. He's demonstrated that in his behavior over a long political career, but he is very afraid of existential systemic risk. This is a thing he talks about all the time. So I'd highlight 3 steps that China has really taken to bolster its own resilience to sanctions. One is consolidating the financial regulatory authorities into a super regulator, which culminated in 2023. A second is continuing to tighten the capital control regime. Now, this is not a perfect regime. As we know, it's very leaky, but manipulating the currency to give the impression to markets and to foreign central banks that China hopes will hold some RMB, that this is a currency that is stable, that will hold its value despite the domestic macroeconomic headwinds that China faces. And then third is an effort to get global banks, including in countries allied to the United States, like France, to sign up for the SIPS system, which is an alternative plumbing for international payments. SIPS in particular seems to be a priority for Xi Jinping. Every major encounter he has had with a world leader since COVID in person has led with an agreement about SIPS. And it's notable that the French, for example, have been very eager to sign up. So let me wrap up briefly. We don't know how China interprets all of the perspectives that we have seen over the last 36 hours about relationship between Russia and the West under situations of economic warfare. Clearly, what the West has done has taken a toll on Russia's economy. Clearly, however, Russia did not face existential risk, and China has a lot of reasons between the size of their foreign exchange reserves and the power of their financial supervisory authorities and the control over the movement of capital that they already have in advance of a crisis, that they could withstand that initial shock. So from that perspective, I think we have to assume that Xi Jinping is becoming more risk tolerant based on what he's thinking, based on what he's seeing. It was discussed yesterday how Russia managed to stabilize the dollar-ruble rate within weeks after the outbreak of hostilities. That's something that China will be very interested in. On the other hand, China faces this structural problem, and I want to close on this point. I'm sure that Mihaela and Zoe will have more thoughts on this. The problem is, under the circumstances of financial warfare being on the table, China faces a catch-22 when it thinks about internationalizing its currency. If it liberalizes its capital account, then it makes itself vulnerable to a sudden imposition of sanctions that could cause mass outflows and chaos in the financial system. But as long as the currency remains not fully convertible, outside actors don't really want to allocate too much value to RMB. And this is the contradiction that China faces. The solution, I think, has been partial RMB internationalization, focusing on the payments channel. But this is far from perfect. And I would suggest that the currency remains China's paramount concern when they're thinking about existential risk from sanctions.
Thank you, Eyck. Zoe? Zoe, can you hear us? No, we can't hear you. Okay, looks like we're working on technical issues. Zoe, how about we come back to you and we can have Mihaela give her remarks? Let's wait another minute. Okay, Mihaela, please, we'll have Zoe back in a few minutes.
Certainly. So thank you so much. I wanted to give a bit of a broader perspective on the Russia-China relations in the context of BRICS, in the context of the panel. So when we think about Russia-China relations, there was this Russian-Chinese joint declaration on a multipolar world and establishment of a new international order. And I would agree with the previous presentation. There is a lot of ideological dimension in it. And there has been this negotiation campaign for a new world order going for now like 27 years. So it's a 27-year of effort where basically the same things that we are discussing in the Russia context have been on the table for both of these countries back then. And that's the idea that every country can choose independently how it develops. No country should seek hegemony, that there are major concerns with discriminatory policies and practices in existing international economic relations, and that sanctions are generally a bad idea, and especially when they are not supported by the UN Security Council. So these ideas, the very same ideas, we see now almost like 3 decades later. And then the question about to what extent do we know what China thinks? China before did not position as directly the US as a problem in the context of geopolitics and geoeconomics, but there was in February of 2023, there was a report that came out from the Chinese government saying US hegemony and its perils. And that report is very direct about what US hegemony and hegemony of the US dollar means for the world. And it argues that it's a source of instability and uncertainty. And every time it discusses it, it basically includes the negative repercussions for developing countries, giving examples of the COVID crisis, and basically arguing that developing countries always are challenged by high inflation, currency depreciation, capital outflows. So there is also a segment on America's economic and financial hegemony as a geopolitical weapon, where China actually calculated that it was 3 sanctions per day during Trump administration and called the United States of sanctions. I tried to go back to the BRICS documents to understand how sanctions are referred to in the BRICS context. And when you look at summit declarations, which means when BRICS leaders meet, what's their output, what you can see that like the question of sanctions is regularly part of these declarations. And the way it's raised, for example, in 2014, an important year, BRICS condemned unilateral military interventions and economic sanctions in violation of international law and universally recognized norms of international relations. So that is portrayed very much as a normative challenge to the system. But then when we look at the BRICS practice, on the one hand, we see that sanctions are linked to the evolution of BRICS cooperation. So, for example, Russia's BRICS presidency in 2015 saw major progress in BRICS cooperation, and that was when Russia decided to pivot toward BRICS much more. And the numbers, we were looking at 47 different issues, data set 2009 to 2021. And we saw that basically the formation of working groups, BRICS working groups, increased by 311% compared to the prior summit. Then we saw the same thing, like huge increase in transnational communication from 40% until 2014 to 75% in 2015. So basically, jump in any form of cooperation among BRICS countries that we were measuring. So also one important area is that Russia, during its presidency, tried to engage as many possible actors in cooperation. And also there was a huge jump in civil cooperation and getting input from civil society, how to even strengthen this cooperation more deeply. One thing that is currently during the upcoming Kazan summit particularly relevant is that actually BRICS now had a deadline from last year's summit to this year's summit. It has a deadline to produce progress on international payment systems. So that's the first time that actually there is like obligation to report back on the progress on international payment system. At the same time, when we look at sanctions, they do constrain BRICS cooperation. BRICS has a major project of developing the new development bank, and new development bank has chosen to respect the sanctions because it was worried about the credit rating downgrade. So it has frozen all loan disbursements and new approvals in Russia since March 2022. And that has been, and it's always looking at the ratings. So that was a hit for the BRICS joint project. Finally, there is a role of sanctions in expansion, where when you look at criteria for BRICS expansion, actually BRICS members are not allowed to have unilateral sanctions. Basically they need to have diplomatic and friendly relations with all existing BRICS member states and should not impose non-UN Security Council authorized sanctions on BRICS member states, which means that in a way, if you want to be a BRICS member, that's something that's your commitment that you're never going to impose unilateral sanctions. And that plays out very interestingly when we are looking at BRICS expansion as a project, especially in light of Russia's idea of having BRICS represent the world majority. And then when you look at like the world majority gets much smaller, the number of countries that you can actually accept to BRICS is much smaller if you say all of those countries who have sanctions are excluded. So you are basically managing with a smaller group of countries. So I think I should stop at that. And
Thank you. Thank you, Mihaela. And Zoe, let's make sure your sound is working.
Hey, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, very
Yeah,
good.
great. Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And also, many thanks to the technical team for very rapidly resolve the technical challenge. I guess I wanted to sort of build upon what Mihaela and Eyck mentioned earlier, but zoom slightly into China, and happy to answer questions broadly. And I wanted to emphasize perhaps two aspects. The first aspect is the importance of financial security as a concept of national security, not just in Xi Jinping era, but actually since the Asian financial crisis. Xi Jinping has basically amplified the importance of financial security, right? But he's not the first time or the first Chinese leader did that. So that's the first point I wanted to make. And then the second part, I wanted to sort of talk about what I consider as the three primary strategies that the Chinese government has pursued to achieve the goal of reducing its strategic vulnerabilities against financial sanctions. And here I wanted to emphasize that these three strategies these three strategies are not necessarily aiming at dethrone the US dollar or making the renminbi the global reserve currency, but the primary concern is to reduce its sanction vulnerability. And these three strategies include supporting and expanding regional and multilateral currency and financial cooperation through various non-Western partnerships. And the second strategy is increasing the broader use of the renminbi in international trade and investment, while also promoting the development of a renminbi-based international financial infrastructure. And I think I already talked a little bit about that. And then lastly, the third strategy that I wanted to cover is the use of renminbi in global commodities pricing. And here, I think this is where China or Chinese policymakers and a lot of Chinese strategists and economists view the global green energy transition as an opportunity for the renminbi to gain a greater share in international trade and settlement. So let me quickly go back to the first broader point in terms of financial security. I think Chinese policymakers, at least through my reading of Chinese documents, it turned out that they have been aware that financial security is part of national security since the 1997 Asian financial crisis. And it was also around that time, Premier Zhu Rongji, he spoke on the record talking about the importance of foreign exchange reserve. And I quote him, he said, foreign exchange reserves are not just economic strength, but also political power. So from that point of view, he started to realize that China accumulated foreign exchange reserve not just for the purpose of maintaining, 3-month trade surplus, 3-month balance of payment purposes, but also in the broader context of maintaining currency stability, macroeconomic stability, and ultimately financial security. And what I think further elevated Chinese leaders thinking about financial security is, again, this started before the West collective sanction against Russia or the decision to freeze Russian foreign exchange reserves. And we can take this all the way back to perhaps, especially in recent years, to the escalation of US-China trade tensions back in 2018. And then this compiled with G7's sanction against Russian entities and individuals. So a lot of these recent events basically catalyzed or make Chinese leaders even more anxious about the lack of financial security of the Chinese, not just the economy, but also the Communist Party's political regime. So from that point of view, I think you started to see not just strategists who I consider may not necessarily know a great deal about economics, like Jin Canrong. It's not just the people like him to talk about the importance of reducing vulnerabilities against sanctions, but you also see Chinese financial regulators, including folks at China's Security Regulatory Commission, talk about the risk of the United States turn the table against China, the table meaning the global financial system dominated by the US dollar against China, and the risk of financial warfare, which I think Eyck highlighted very nicely. Now, knowing that the importance of financial security, or for that matter, the lack of financial security in China's for China's macroeconomic stability, I now wanted to sort of explain a little bit what I consider as the 3 primary strategies. Now, the first one, supporting and expanding regional and multilateral currency and financial cooperation. Here, this is more again, this does not start from like BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Initially, my study of the document traced back to Asian financial crisis, but at that time, China was more or less going along with ASEAN countries, and more specifically Japan. And in fact, when Japan's finance ministry proposed the idea of establishing an Asian monetary fund, and actually China went along. But unfortunately, when the United States basically killed the Asian monetary fund in those days, this catalyzed the later regional currency architecture cooperation, such as the Xingmai Initiative. And guess what? Once the West collectively sanctioned Russia, and in particular the decision to freeze Russian foreign exchange reserve and so on and so forth, you started to see the revitalization of Asian monetary fund. And this time, I think one of the most outspoken person would be Malaysian prime minister, and he talked about it when he visited Beijing, and he also talked about it through multilateral platforms. I had the opportunity to interview him once when he came over to CFR, and I asked him exactly why he wanted to propose this idea again. And his answer was very much similar to what Mihaela described in terms of these countries, from Malaysian point of view, they do not necessarily want it to be subject to become a collateral damage in great power competition, or for that matter, they do not want it to be eliminated or removed the opportunity to continue trading with China, in addition to other macroeconomic stability concerns, such as, whenever there is a financial crisis in the United States, emerging market economy tend to become collateral damage. So that's that. And China tend to go along, initially trying to go went along with other countries, but with the rise of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you started to see China actively use these multilateral non-Western partnerships to develop the broader use of renminbi. And then the second part I want to talk about, the second channel would be the use of the active development of the active use of renminbi in international trade and the development of renminbi-based international financial infrastructure. Here, Eyck talked a little bit about the CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, and I think here I wanted to just put a footnote or like give a number here just to show how quickly this has developed. Again, when we think about when CIPS was launched back in 2015, the idea was to increase the international use of renminbi, or more precisely, to make Chinese exporters more easily to make payment with their foreign counterpart. And the idea was that small Chinese banks, there were more than 2,000 of them, small Chinese banks, they didn't have access to SWIFT. Hence, a lot of the transactions are very difficult. But with the development of CIPS, the idea was to make sure that Chinese exporters can export in a more convenient way. But again, things started to change, especially when the collective sanction against Russia happened. And as of March last year, renminbi overtook the US dollar for the first time, taking a greater share of China's international trade settlement. And I think that's a noteworthy data point. And lastly, in terms of the use of renminbi in global commodities pricing, here I just wanted to point out that they recognize the petrodollar system, and they recognize that it is going to be very difficult for the renminbi to challenge the petrodollar system. However, given that natural gas is considered as a green transition fuel, and there is no global market for the trading of natural gas, they see at least the Chinese economists, and including President Xi Jinping himself, talk about the use of renminbi in commodities pricing, and in particular in natural gas. So I just stop there, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zoe. And I'm glad we were able to get you get your sound working. So all three of you spoke about China's work to become more resilient to financial sanctions. I wonder if anyone can speak about China's resilience to sanctions that may impact its industries and supply chains. Yesterday, we heard about China's vulnerability to the sanctions on advanced technologies, sanctions on certain goods, products that can be used in manufacturing. And so how is China dealing with the most recent sanctions on semiconductors, on the measures that were taken against Huawei? Can we get kind of a status update on that? Eyck, maybe you want to take that question?
So there's others in the room, namely Chris, who may have more insight on this question than I do. I would just say, and I'll come back to your question, something that I think was a common theme in all three of these presentations is that there is an assumption in Beijing that there is broad-based dissatisfaction with the way that the US is currently running its economic order, however you want to define it. And that in particular, third countries, especially in the developing world, do not want to be threatened by the United States and told, pick sides, trade with us or trade with them. And it is largely because of this belief that China is making sanctions busting technologies such a core part of its diplomacy towards much of the global South. And I think that it reveals something pretty profound about how Beijing thinks a financial conflict with the US would play out. Namely, that if China can survive the initial gut punch to its financial system, that other countries would essentially help it break the stranglehold of US sanctions because these countries would not want to lose access to the Chinese market and would find ways around sanctions, whether through trading in RMB, trading illicitly in dollars, or some other way. So I think there is an assumption that the transshipment issue, the incentives to exploit arbitrage opportunities by transshipping through sanctions or blockades, which is a phenomenon that we know has been true across history, would apply in this case. And so the belief is, how do we essentially build enough resilience for our financial system and our industry so that they can survive a temporary period of supply chains being out of whack, but assuming that things would be resolved relatively quickly within months. And I think this informs some of the stockpiling behavior that we've seen, where China's strategic petroleum reserve is now approaching 1 billion barrels. They have enormous stockpiles of food. Something like 70% of the world's grain reserves are in China. Stockpiles of machine tools and components and spare parts. Stockpiles of other sorts of commodities. So there is an assumption that they may have supply chains seriously damaged in the short to medium term, but that in a conflict, this is not something that would drag on for years because the rest of the global economy would not allow it. Now, as far as how their industry is faring in the context of export controls on chips, for example, I think we should invite Chris to weigh in. I think it seems like it's too soon to tell. Clearly, they're not accessing NVIDIA GPUs at the scale that the Western hyperscalers are able to access. But I've seen some headlines suggesting that the black market for NVIDIA GPUs is alive and well in China, and actually they're not much more expensive on that side of the line than they are on this side, which suggests that probably a substantial number are being trafficked through in some way.
Zoe, you want to weigh in? I guess I have another question, then we'll turn it over to Q&A. I'm happy
Can I
to.
weigh in quickly?
Go ahead.
I think I was just muted. Okay, great. Thank you. I agree with what I just mentioned, but I wanted to sort of very quickly just summarize based upon my recent trip. I just came back from China as of yesterday morning or the day before yesterday. I visited some factories and talked with people, asked exactly the question that you raised. And I got two different answers. The first one is I realized that there are a substantial number of people who are benefiting or making money out of trading with Russia. And then there is also a group of people who have stopped trading with Russia specifically because they were concerned, or they have been concerned about denying visa to go to the United States. And I talked with a few people who were recently denied a visa going to the United States, despite that we previously had got 10-year visas. And across different conversations, folks told me that one of the reasons, more likely reasons, is because on their passport there were stamps of, like Russian stamps. So that's one side of the story. And then the other part, in terms of reducing sanction vulnerabilities from supply chain point, I think now the go-to word is self-sufficiency, not just in terms of like the so-called bottleneck technologies, but also in terms of how local government officials getting promoted. I think a couple of years ago, they started to talk about, they implemented this supply chain chief mechanism, meaning like local government needs to be, they are held accountable and they are held responsible to develop a supply chain, secure and stable supply chain for whatever strategic industries in their jurisdiction. So from that point of view, I do think doubling down on self-sufficiency and concentrating a lot of more resources to support supply chain security is going to be the kind of mega trend going forward.
Great. And then just one more question from me. We know that the financial system is a vulnerability for China, and something that the United States, the West, could weaponize if the economic warfare were to escalate. I wonder if Chinese policymakers are thinking about the vulnerabilities that the West has and how to leverage them in economic warfare, things like critical minerals, rare earth elements, supply chains for other various industries like green energy, pharmaceuticals, electronics, so on and so forth, ports, even debt and investment leverage. How are Chinese decision makers thinking about responses to economic warfare? Eyck, do you want to take that
Zoe,
one?
do you have thoughts? If not, I'll take a crack at that one. All right, she might.
No, how about you just go forward because I somehow I have an issue muting or unmuting myself. I guess I'm not allowed to unmute myself. So why don't you just go ahead, and then we'll start from there.
So I think there's a number of ways which are obvious in which China could gravely harm the United States and in fact the rest of the world, where China is deeply involved in complex supply chains that have built up over the course of many years that would take years to decades to rebuild in the rest of the world. I think, for example, of that the supply chain for an iPhone, which includes hundreds, if not thousands, of custom parts, many of which are made by single manufacturers in China that developed those components in a multi-year relationship with Apple. And I think the difficulty that Apple has had moving its supply chains out of China, despite this obvious geopolitical risk, highlights how central China probably is to lots of supply chains that we take for granted because of those, that one component out of 20,000 that Chris was talking about yesterday. I think it's important to remember that because China, unlike the United States, doesn't have the prerogative of the global hegemonic currency, they don't have an all-seeing eye into where their products go after they leave their market. And that means they can't isolate the United States with export controls. If they want to not export something to the United States, well, then they can't very well export it to Panama or Liberia either, because those countries might resell it to the United States. So in a crisis scenario, I can definitely imagine lots of components, especially inputs on dual use military equipment, becoming export controlled. And I still don't have perfect confidence that the US and allied militaries have totally audited their defense supply chains and made sure there's not a single Chinese made piece in there. But if we're talking about raw materials, and especially if we're talking about something like applied active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are just by their nature, we've all looked at prescription medicine, this stuff has expiration dates, it's hard to stockpile. I think the effect of export controlling that would be that the United States and other wealthy countries would buy up the supply as they did buy up the vaccines during COVID, and developing countries would be hard hit. I think there's other tools of economic coercion that would likely be more effective. And I would highlight import restrictions. China has demonstrated this ability to use customs excuses when it's unhappy with someone else's behavior to let your pineapples rot on the docks or something like that. And they can also restrict the flow of tourists, which can be devastating, especially in the Pacific Islands and in many ASEAN countries, which would be strategically important during any crisis contingency where the US would actually be thinking about going to economic warfare. So my suspicion is that China would be relatively restrained in its use of these tools, because China's goal in a crisis would be to portray the United States as the escalatory actor who's undermining the rules-based trading system and saying, side with us if you want to get back to normal. And so insofar as they would use instruments of economic coercion, I suspect that they would use them relatively narrowly, and they would use them to try to divide the United States coalition, particularly in East Asia. And they would highlight, for example, countries like South Korea.
Great. Thank you, Eyck. I now invite you to line up in front of the microphone to ask questions. There is a question for Zoe on Zoom, so I'll go ahead and read it. Zoe, you mentioned that the petrodollar system was difficult for China to break into, but that there was no global market for natural gas yet. Can you expand on that idea and the opportunities China sees to capitalize on?
Sure. Happy to answer that question. Like when we think about the crowning moment, this is something that we oftentimes think about, the crowning moment of when the US dollar became the global currency or global reserve and trading currency. We tend to think that, when back in the 70s, when the United States convinced Saudi Arabia to price and settle oil in US dollars, and then followed by the entire OPEC decided to use the dollar to trade and settle oil. That becomes underpinned this whole petrodollar system, which today, the 80% of the global economy is based upon hydrocarbons. So that's the petrodollar system. And I think Chinese economists are right to think that, yes, there is a development of renminbi-based or renminbi oil futures in Shanghai, but when you think about the participation as well as the transaction volume, is still way below the dollar-based system. Whereas the natural gas market is different in the sense that there's no natural gas market to the same extent as the global oil market, right? It matters where you buy and trade natural gas. It's in US, in Europe, in Asia, and more specifically, even in Asia, there is no regional trading hub. So from that point of view, there is an opportunity for China to first establish a regional natural gas trading hub, such that renminbi becomes the trading and pricing currency of natural gas in Asia, and then try to expand their contract format so that this becomes one vehicle for the renminbi to become more influential, at least through the global energy transition. And natural gas is not just one form of channels where China wanted to expand the use of renminbi in global commodities pricing. They have been doing similar things and established domestic exchanges for rare earth minerals and other critical metals. Thank you.
Questions? Go ahead. If you can turn that microphone on.
Okay. Yes, I just wanted to expand on that question. Yes, I'm Margarita Balmaceda. I was a speaker yesterday. Concerning the use of the Chinese currency as international currency for commodities, would you expand a little bit on the interface between that and decarbonization options? You kind of gave a hint at this a moment ago when you talked about the establishment of exchanges for rare earth materials, but could you say a little bit more about that and about how maybe we may see some behavior on China's part trying to actually turn the trade of these increasingly important goods as traded in Chinese currency?
Sure. I think there are two important, from technical point of view, there are two aspects of it. The first one is you have to, in order for the renminbi to become a more globally desired, you have to have the demand side, meaning which is to have the renminbi version of the US dollar denominated asset. And the go-to US dollar denominated asset would be the US Treasuries, which is the largest and the most liquid and the most depth in terms of market. So China has been thinking about doing that through the use of renminbi, by promoting the use of renminbi government bond through clearance houses, such that the renminbi government bond can potentially become collateral. So that's one way that they are trying to do on the asset side, such that the investability of renminbi asset can increase. And then on the flip side of that would be the currency itself. Then on the currency itself, the reason why people talk a little bit of natural gas yuan is trying to maybe pivot away from petrodollar instead of focusing merely on the use of renminbi in international oil market trade, which is the background of the establishment of the Shanghai the renminbi-based oil futures in Shanghai. Then instead of focusing merely on that, the idea was to develop market for trading, developing financial instrument and financial asset, and then establish exchanges such that the pricing of commodities, especially commodities that are relatively niche and there is no global market for it, then this is the area where China can step in. And on rare earth mineral, there is we already launched this rare earth exchanges using renminbi in内蒙古. There is another one on rare earth metals in Ganzhou, which is a place where China has a lot of industrial use and actually deposit of rare of critical metals as well. Does that answer the question? From asset point of view and from financial instrument point of view, in terms of the currency denominated asset and the exchanges.
Mihaela, can I ask you about the prospects for the development of BRICS currency? We had a question about that earlier today as it relates to the international financial system, but in terms of denominating more international trade in renminbi, I wonder how that might be connected.
So BRICS currency has been on the agenda for a while. Last year, during the BRICS summit, there was a major debate whether to even discuss it or not. And all of the BRICS were aligned that it needs to be discussed, except for India that actually mentioned that it wasn't even on the agenda. So in a way, and before, like South Africa said, yes, it was on the agenda, everything will be discussed. So one area of activities within BRICS was to think about the international payment system rather than BRICS currency by itself. President Lula actually was the one who mentioned that BRICS currency could follow the euro currency path, but there is no monetary coordination at such a level that that would be feasible. And BRICS are not nearly ready to do that. So basically, instead of that being the major agenda item that like Russia and Brazil were interested in, the agenda item during the last summit was basically thinking more in terms of international payment system and then trying to pick up on some of the work that has been done and having like finance ministers coordinate action on that. Currently, all of the discussions are behind closed doors. So it's almost like, you know, every day there's like a new article. Oh, there will be a gold-backed currency. There will be this, there will be that. But the latest, like when you look at actually the Russian economy saying more of the debate is around whether there would be a basket of currencies rather than a specific currency or basket of commodities or combining basket of currencies and basket of commodities. So trying not to think about one single BRICS country, but trying to develop something new. At the same time, there are different debates about CBDC. So at this point, there is a lot of balls in the air. But I would expect at the summit, which is coming up in 3 weeks, we will know much more because that's the time when anything, whatever they have done, they need to report. So whether that will be behind closed doors or we will get some sense of developments remains to be seen. But it's exciting to watch for sure.
Dan, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, Dan Dresner. Eyck brought up the fact that obviously China is not just concerned about being a defensive actor in terms of economic coercion, but it also obviously, no matter what it says officially, it also practices offensive economic coercion. And it's worth remembering that part of the reason we're here is that the origins of Russia's war in Ukraine actually were Russia's active attempts to economically coerce Ukraine into joining the Eurasian Union and not join the EU's Eastern Partnership. So one of the things I'm curious about lessons learned is we obviously know that Xi Jinping very badly wants Taiwan to be reunified with China. That would be his, potential legacy accomplishment. What are the odds that if he does do, and people in Washington are obsessed with the idea of when is this going to happen? Is this going to happen during the 20s and so on and so forth? I guess my question is if we do see a move on Taiwan, are we likely to see it start with attempts at economic coercion? Or would it be the case that China would not do that in the hopes of achieving tactical surprise?
Eyck, do you want to tackle that one?
China's already economically coercing Taiwan. They do it at various levels and they dial it up and down because the playbook for Taiwan involves both carrots and sticks. Economic coercion has been at the heart of how the PRC has engaged with Taiwan since the two sides of the strait resumed exchanges and trade in the late 80s and early 90s. So I would expect, yes, this is going to continue. And I would expect to see, especially under the new administration, which is deeply distrusted in Beijing, more excuses to do exercises that will disrupt international shipping and cause civilian airlines to avoid international airspace, probably doing so for longer periods of time and with less notice than before. China wants to show Taiwan that it's alone. China wants to show Taiwan that it has been abandoned, not only by the community of nations, but by the financial markets and by private actors that are afraid of getting on Beijing's bad side. Because the strategy of so-called peaceful unification is about coerced compliance. It's about making Taiwan believe that the pathway to achieving a stable equilibrium as an independent state is foreclosed, and therefore the only possible way forward is to negotiate the terms of surrender. Now, I don't have a good answer as to whether Beijing would choose to move if it chose to do the big one in terms of a surprise first strike on US and allied forces in the region or some kind of quarantine or blockade. The argument for starting with a surprise first strike is if you assume that the United States will not tolerate Taiwan's unification under any circumstances, then you assume that the US is inevitably getting involved. And if you do, you potentially gain a large operational advantage by seizing the time and place and manner of the first strike, particularly because the vessels that the United States would need to fight a kinetic war over Taiwan, and in particular, these are submarines, not surface ships, live on the west coast of the United States and take about 2 weeks to get across the Pacific. On the other hand, you have to assume that China couldn't mobilize in secret. The United States would know that this was coming. The United States would ramp up its presence in the region. So the advantage of getting the surprise in that sense may not actually be all that great. There's another way of thinking about it, which is if China moves against Taiwan through a blockade, or I think more likely a quarantine, what they would do is they would deny that what they were doing was some major effort to change the status quo. They would present it as a status quo action. They would probably present it as the US presented its quarantine of Cuba in 1962 and say, we're doing an embargo of the US sending offensive weapons to Taiwan or something. And it would be an attempt to control Taiwan's international trade by essentially saying to private shippers, you are free to come and go from Taiwan. You are free to fly in and out of Taiwan as long as you clear a port of call first on the mainland. And that, in a sense, is an effort to forcibly take control of Taiwan's international trade without firing a shot. I think the attraction of this scenario to Beijing and the danger to the United States is that it would force us and our partners to be the ones to draw the line and say, no, this is actually not the status quo. This is a fundamental attempt to revise the status quo, and we are willing to go to the brink over it. The problem is if we have a menu of options, which are things that are very scary and damaging to us, it's possible that in the event we may lack the resolve or our coalition may lack the unity to do that. So I do think that this is very much on the menu. And I think that when Beijing uses economic coercion against Taiwan in the gray zone, part of what they are doing is they are testing us. Because as far as they push and we don't draw a red line, they're getting closer and closer to the goal.
Can I ask you about a kind of another red line that the United States has drawn, which has to do with Chinese lethal aid to Russia in support of its invasion of Ukraine? We've heard rumors that that has been going on, at least the term that was used is not non-lethal. And I wonder how Chinese policymakers are thinking about this in terms of secondary sanctions, in terms of what kinds of responses might come from the West, and also how Chinese companies are thinking about providing support to Russia, because clearly they're encroaching on that red line at times.
Well, you're looking at me, but I want to give Zoe and Mihaela a chance to answer. All I would say is the threat of sanctions might actually be more effective than the imposition, especially because China's financial system is resilient. Essentially, the whole thing is state-backed. And so if we impose blocking sanctions on one state bank, fine. The sanctioning activity can just move to another, probably a larger one. And in the worst case, they could create a walled off institution that exists solely to do transactions with sanctioned entities overseas. And if they did that, that might be used for trade with Iran, with North Korea, with Venezuela, with other bad guys that we don't want. So I suppose the problem with threatening this is that if we then go ahead and do something and the effect is nil, that undermines our credibility. And it actually undermines the credibility of the big stick.
Zoe?
Just to very quickly, I wanted to, I think on the company side, again, it depends upon the company's market exposure. Some in an era where the United States and the West in general are lowering or trying to impose tariff on Chinese export. I think a lot of Chinese manufacturers, they have at least incentive to keep their cash flow so that they move forward with boosting export to Russia. And then on the lethal weapon part, I remember I did get a chance to talk to this one particular individual, and she was previously a PLA soldier, officer, I would say, and then she now works at a state-owned enterprise, but not necessarily the main arm, but instead is the investment arm of this state-owned enterprise. So from the way that they think about the lethal weapons is that they would cite the Chinese export controls. They say that China has this regulatory framework. They have official document banning itself to export weapons to parties at war. So from that point of view, I think they do have a legal framework to defend themselves. And I do think that the Chinese government is using or strengthening the domestic legislations to legitimize the way that China either sanction others or develop anti-sanction regime. And then last but not least, I would say in terms of, a lot of these, I agree with Eyck in terms of sanction versus anti-sanctions. The way that I think about this is that sanctions or sanction mitigation is like, taking overdose of antibiotics. This antibiotics works this time, but it may not necessarily work the other time. So the more we use sanctions, the more we incentivize different ways of sanction evasion. And here, at least from transaction point of view, import, export, or trade settlement, major Chinese major Chinese banks would not necessarily be facilitating sanctions, in particular when we are talking about the big four state-owned banks, because they are very much entrenched in the dollar-based system. But it's those over 2,000 small and medium-sized banks that are potentially problematic in the sense of cushioning sanction. And one such example would be Heilongjiang Bank. And the bank, that bank is very close to, the Heilongjiang is very close to Russia. And even when the West sanctioned Russia, the banks, the Heilongjiang Bank, the local official was very much outspoken, saying that Heilongjiang should continue its open up and trade with the North, China's northern neighbor, which I guess is Russia. And for a lot of these small and regional banks, because they did not really have connections with the SWIFT system, there is no fear of losing it.
Another question.
Thank you, everyone, so much for this presentation. I'm Christine Liu, MIT Political Science. Everyone sort of talked about how China's concerned with its vulnerability in economic financial sectors. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how China's reacting to perhaps the limitations of U.S. economic power, including what we talked about, U.S. reluctance to impose more stringent sort of measures, and perhaps Russia's ability to I guess, resist some of the economic pressures in some areas. Does China feel a bit more reassured by those sort of cases? What is its takeaway there? Be my question.
Would like to answer that. Zoe, do you think China has learned any lessons from Russia's ability to adapt to Western sanctions?
I think this is an extremely good question. And I myself am trying to figure out what lessons that China has learned. At least the first part, especially if we look at the news headlines and the heightened effort against corruptions in the military, I think at least they realize that you just cannot trust your own guys. You just have to make sure that the PLA is combat ready, in the sense that you just cannot use oil that's supposed to power rocket, use those oil for hot pot and things like that. So I think that's one lesson in terms of anti-corruption, in terms of strengthening the combat readiness of the PLA. And then I think the second lesson probably China has learned, or if I were, again, I've never talked with Xi Jinping, I don't know how he thinks, but if I view through his lens, I would say that at least the other very important lesson is China would not want to, and this build up on Eyck's answer to Professor Dresner's question in terms of Taiwan. I think unless China were cornered to take a military action against Taiwan, and then again we have to be very careful in terms of defining when is the start of a military action, right? What is the form of that? But putting that aside, I think they realized that if possible, we would want to strengthen China's sanction. They would reduce China's sanction vulnerability as much as possible, build up China's self-defense against Western sanctions until that day, when imposing sanctions on China is at least equally costly, if not more costly, on sanctioners, they probably would not want to make a military action against Taiwan. And part of the reason is that perhaps Putin thought the war could quickly end, but then it turned out that it's not as easy as that.
There's another question from Zoom. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, have there been any developments that have surprised you when it comes to China's response in the aftermath, or have China's choices been entirely predictable?
In my view, entirely predictable based on what one would have expected from reading the elite conversation prior to February 22.
I think Mihaela can also chime in here, because she has done a lot of interesting work in terms of China BRICS, and in particular how BRICS react to this Russia's to the war.
So China wasn't really that much invested in BRICS before, and I think when Russia in a way pivoted toward BRICS, Russia developed cooperation infrastructure of BRICS in a way that worked for China. And basically, I'm not surprised overall how it responded, but I am surprised how I saw China getting more and more engaged and interested in BRICS. So almost like Russia's pivot and Russia-China strong relations actually encouraged China's pivot as well. So, and just the depth, how far China is willing to go to accommodate Russia within BRICS, that has surprised me, especially like, for example, all of the BRICS decided not to follow their presidencies, but actually that this presidency now, Russia's presidency, can happen instead of Brazil's presidency that was next in line. So basically, they accommodated, all of the BRICS countries accommodated Russia to enable it to actually have the entire presidency in Russia and not to have Vladimir Putin risk arrest like was the case in South Africa. So this level of accommodation and this level of deepening continuously collaboration with Russia, but also figuring out ways to engage global South all the time. I think that's something that both like China was inspired by Russia, but also influenced by Russia's situation.
I think we have time for just one last question. Well, you know what? It looks like there are two hands raised, so we can collect both.
I'm Alex, first year student at Fletcher. My question is more directed to everyone because I want as many good answers as possible. So Dr. Freymann said about Xi Jinping is this person who, like, his character makes him want to make, he's less risk aversive now. He's willing to put more onto the table now to get what he wants at this point. And then Zoe talked about China is using a lot of the regional partnerships to achieve a lot of the accomplishments that it has. So my question would be, what has China lost perhaps during that process, especially during regional partnership? Because I did a little bit of research on RCEP before, and to me, it looks like a partnership that it's more about the dollarization of the ASEAN countries and all the partners. And also, if you look at the structure of RCEP, there are many countries that are considered traditionally as US allies, for example, Australia and Japan. And then if you look at the trade between China and Vietnam during RCEP, well, after signing the RCEP, a lot of the lower level manufacturer actually moved to Vietnam and then to ASEAN countries. And then what does China get in return of that? Well, I see Zoe's nodding already, so maybe she also answer that first.
Thank
Thank
you for
you.
the question.
Hi, my name is Nayan. I'm a student here and I'm also a journalist. I have a couple of questions, very quick.
Quickly.
One question, the first one is about the overall strategy that we have of deterrence against China and Russia. Any successful deterrence strategy should have credible threats and assurances. So I have a question regarding assurances. What is in store for China? If there's a change in behavior towards Russia, why should China do it? Are we lacking in terms of assuring China if change in behavior would lead or would not lead to adversarial actions when at a time when you're already have export controls, sanctions, we have gone down that road very quickly in terms of how we perceive China as an adversary. That's one. Second, about stockpiling, I think you mentioned. A lot has been written recently about stockpiling and how China is increasing the level of stockpiling of natural resources and other of China trying to be ready for a plan with Taiwan. Is there action on the cards, or is it just a country trying to defend itself? It's a natural response by a country which has been sanctioned or have been regularly threatened in terms of their economic security.
Great. So maybe we can go around and just have each of you give some concluding remarks. Zoe, would you like to start?
Sure. But here for the first question, I wanted to highlight Mihaela's work in her because she was a diplomat but she also teaches negotiation So negotiation is really all about what you give, what you get, right? I want to hear Mihaela's answer on that too. But just very briefly in terms of what I think China lost. Obviously, the first one, the first and foremost would be there is international reputation, and then secondly, I think Russia has become a more of a damage to China's international prestige or international influence than a strategic asset. Then the third one that China has lost is actually a good relationship with the West. And if you think about how China has been able to transform its economy from one of the poorest countries in the world to now the second largest economy in the world, I would say, yes, there are the hard work of the Chinese people, but then it's also the tailwind of reform and open up, specifically because of the support technology from the West. So from that point of view, I think it cost China a lot of the tailwind benefit its long-term economic development. And on deterrence, I defer that to Eyck because he's really the strategic thinker among us. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Mihaela.
So I think the big challenge here for us in the US is the inconsistency in foreign policy. And that's the biggest weakness. And so you can talk about, of course, the lack of grand strategy in terms of international cooperation, multilateral cooperation. But I mean, obviously, like there was a deterrence failure, and there is not a clear strategy what will happen given that we have currently in the US two candidates who are completely different. So if we are in a situation in the US where the US does not seem to be aligning well with the global South, and currently BRICS are aligning more and more together, there is a larger question of to what extent the US can produce something creative as a long-term strategy for its own role and for the larger role of kind of provision of global collective goods. And I don't think that the US is there yet. So it's very much a question of how can in the US bipartisan collaboration evolve. And that's of course to be seen in 2 months with our or in a month with our elections.
I completely second everything that Mihaela just said. To answer the questions briefly, what has China lost? In one word, Europe. I don't remember the exact quote, but one of the last times Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met, Xi Jinping said, the world trend of globalization and multipolarization is inevitable, and we are the ones driving it forward together. Now that meant one thing before 2022, that means another thing now. And the fact that this war has brought about not only a revitalization of the transatlantic alliance, but has made Europe understand the significance of peace and stability in the Pacific is not a good thing for China. It's not a good thing at all, especially as the allies, the democratic allies, take the first steps towards building a more integrated defense industrial base. In terms of deterrence and reassurance, both sides are trying to deter one another. Xi Jinping has reason to believe that the United States doesn't want Taiwan to unify with the mainland under any circumstances. Now, the US One China policy says we do not support Taiwan independence, and we will respect the democratic choice of the people of Taiwan as to what they want to do. And Beijing seems to have decided that the US One China policy has been hollowed out because that's not true anymore. It's very difficult, since Beijing has persuaded itself of that, for the US to provide new reassurances. The United States is bound by commitments to Taiwan as well. All that we can do is continue to reiterate the One China policy, which is that we oppose the unilateral change in the status quo by either side. We value peace and stability. This has been our policy for 50 years. We're not changing the policy. Why is Xi Jinping building these stockpiles? Well, to a certain extent, he wants to demonstrate to the West that we could not win a protracted economic conflict with him because he is prepared to hunker down and take a lot of pain. And if he survives what we throw at him on day one and soon after, that he can outlast us. And he's calculating that if he can credibly demonstrate that, the West will decide Taiwan is not worth protecting because the costs and risk of trying to protect Taiwan are too great. He is trying to take Taiwan without a war so that this world trend of globalization and multipolarization can continue and China can achieve rejuvenation without a big war. But he's also prepared for the possibility that a war might be inevitable. And I think you have to understand the stockpiling is having both purposes. And that means we have to take him very seriously and we need to do our own contingency planning.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.